So if the world feels a bit, well, chaotic lately, like alarms are going off everywhere,
Yeah, it definitely does.
record government shutdowns, election results that raise eyebrows, and, I mean, the loose security password being Louvre. You just can't make that up. If you're noticing this stuff, you're definitely paying attention.
Oh, absolutely. We're swimming in signals, aren't we?
Yeah.
And the chaos is, well, it's everywhere. You've got the immediate stuff, right? Politics, the economy looking
The
shaky.
fakes, yeah.
And then you have these like deeper currents, security holes, tech moving at lightning speed, stuff that changes what it even means to be human. It's almost impossible to keep track of it all.
Exactly. So our mission today is to take this big, messy pile of sources we've gathered, and it really covers the gamut. We're talking macroeconomics, election deep dives, critical infrastructure security, think Dutch water pumps, and NYC rent, all the way to, the huge energy cost of AI and brain-computer interfaces moving faster than anyone thought possible.
We need to connect those dots.
Yeah, weave it together. Try to find the threads connecting these crises that seem on the surface totally unrelated. Cut through the noise, find some coherence.
And the sources are really diverse, which is helpful. We've got some heavy technical analysis, some pretty blunt political commentary, especially on those recent elections, and then the cutting-edge science on brain tech.
A real mix.
It is. And as we connect these things, I think you'll start to see a pattern emerge. It often comes back to the same human stuff, doesn't it? Complacency, predictable self-interest, maybe not learning from history.
Seems likely.
These forces are popping up everywhere simultaneously. Financial markets, our physical defenses, even in like the futuristic tech lab. So yeah, the goal is context, clarity, in what feels like a really unstable, accelerating moment.
Okay, let's dive into that political and economic instability first. The recent elections, the sources are calling it a blue wave. We saw some significant Democratic wins.
It's right. Governors in New Jersey and Virginia, Prop 50 out in California passed.
And crucially for this discussion, the election of Mom Donnie as the new mayor of New York City.
Yes, and that NYC result is where a lot of the source material really focuses its, let's call it anxiety, this Mom Donnie figure. And that nickname itself tells you something, right? It implies the sort of overbearing, micromanaging regulatory approach.
Treating the city like a kid who needs strict rules.
Exactly. That immediately set off alarm bells for the economic analysts we looked at. The core critique isn't subtle. It's that the proposed policies aren't really designed fundamentally to lift people out of poverty or genuinely help the middle class.
So if not helping, then what is the motivation, according to this analysis? Is it just ideology?
It's interpreted less as pure ideology or altruism and more as a desire to punish the wealthy, or at least to reshape the city through a lens of pretty deep class resentment. If you look at the policies, things like big shifts in property taxes, more regulation, and especially the push for stuff like severe rent control, which has a terrible history, if you view it through the lens of punishing the rich, the actions suddenly make a kind of sense. A destructive sense maybe, but sense.
And the sources are pretty blunt about where they think this leads economically. They use the term catastrophic economic issues. That's strong.
It is strong language, yeah. Because mechanically, from an economic perspective, these policies are seen as the exact opposite of what you'd do to create a vibrant, growing middle class. The biggest red flag they keep circling back to is bringing back severe rent control.
Which isn't just some minor policy tweak. It has a history.
A really devastating, well-documented history. We need to be clear here, we're not talking about small side effects. We're talking about the kind of economic decay that ravaged places like the Bronx back in the 70s and 80s.
Okay, let's unpack that history for listeners who might not remember it vividly. How does rent control lead to, well, urban decay?
It's a pretty straightforward mechanism, unfortunately. When you impose really strict rent caps, it destroys the financial incentive for property owners to invest in their buildings. If fixing a boiler or replacing a roof costs way more than you can ever hope to recoup in rent, guess what?
You don't fix the boiler.
You don't fix the boiler, you don't repair the facade, investment just evaporates, maintenance stops, the quality of the housing stock plummets.
And that starts a downward spiral, right?
Yeah.
Physical decay attracts other problems.
Exactly. Run-down buildings, poorly maintained areas, they become magnets for instability, for crime. Then property values fall, which erodes the city's tax base, so there's less money for services, which makes things worse. And in the worst cases back then, some landlords, feeling trapped, just walked away or even, tragically, resorted to arson.
Leading to those awful images of blocks of burned-out buildings. That wasn't a natural disaster. It was, according to this analysis, a predictable policy outcome.
A completely predictable, mechanical result of a policy that sounds good but ignores basic economics. And the great irony, as the sources put it, is that we eventually fixed those problems, slowly, painfully, through deregulation, bringing back market incentives, allowing capital to flow back in and rebuild.
Yet here we are, potentially starting the same cycle over again in NYC.
That's the core fear. It's this idea of the Cassandra complex playing out.
Cassandra from Greek mythology. Cursed to see the future but never be believed.
Precisely. For those who study this stuff, who know the history, the outcome of these NYC policies seems clear. More crime, worse quality of life, businesses and capital eventually fleeing. But right now, the political momentum is such that nobody seems to be listening to the warnings.
They're just marching towards it.
Marching straight towards a self-inflicted wound. The source material predicts it'll get so bad, the decay, the danger, that eventually the political pendulum will swing violently back the other way. Voters will desperately seek out candidates promising safety, order, and economic basics, restarting the whole cycle. It's a tragedy of forgetting, really. Hashtag tag 1.2, inflation, markets, and the role of the wealthy.
Okay, let's zoom out from NYC to the bigger picture. Macro instability. The conversation there seems dominated by two things: inflation and government messing with the financial markets.
Yeah, those are the big ones. And the source material uses some pretty vivid language for inflation, calling it secretive theft.
Secretive theft. Let's break that down. Why theft? Why secretive?
Well, it's theft because inflation fundamentally erodes the purchasing power of every dollar you hold, especially savings. If the money supply expands rapidly or costs just spiral, your money simply buys less. It's a hidden tax, essentially.
Okay, that makes sense. And the secretive part?
It's secretive because it's not like a tax bill that arrives in the mail, right? The mechanisms, Federal Reserve actions, global supply chains, government spending, are complex, often opaque. It's hard for the average person to see exactly who's doing the stealing or why their grocery bill just jumped 20%.
So who actually benefits from this theft?
That's the crucial part. Inflation disproportionately benefits those who own assets and those who hold significant debt. If you owe a lot of money, inflation makes that debt cheaper to pay back in real terms over time.
Right.
And if you own things, real estate, stocks, commodities, gold, their nominal value tends to rise with inflation, protecting or even massively increasing your wealth. Now, who owns most of the assets in the U.S.?
It's heavily concentrated at the top.
Exactly. Maybe the top 1%, maybe 3% of the population holds the vast majority. So when you have high inflation, it tends to create this almost unhinged concentration of wealth at the very top, while everyone else effectively gets poorer.
Which connects to the second major point in the sources. The problem with government intervention basically removing the possibility of failure, even for the rich.
Yes, this is critical. The sources argue that a healthy capitalist system needs failure. It needs bad bets to be wiped out, inefficient companies to go under. Market downturns are like a cleansing mechanism. They redistribute assets, they punish poor decisions.
Prevents stagnation and extreme concentration.
Right. But when the government constantly steps in with bailouts, with quantitative easing, with policies designed to prop up markets and prevent any significant downturns, it removes that essential discipline. It protects the biggest players, the too big to fail institutions.
So you end up socializing the losses, but keeping the gains private.
Precisely. And that guarantees this relentless upward concentration of wealth, creating what the source calls a grotesque margin between the super rich and everyone else, regardless of whether those at the top are actually making smart decisions or just benefiting from the safety net.
And inevitably, that massive concentration of wealth translates into political influence, doesn't it? The sources point fingers here.
They do. They mention specific figures, like George Soros and his son Alex, arguing that their actions, often framed as philanthropy or political engagement, are fundamentally about structuring markets and global affairs to protect their vast portfolios.
They bring up the classic example of Soros breaking the Bank of England.
Yeah, back in '92, Black Wednesday. He famously bet against the British pound, seeing a flaw in their monetary policy, and made a fortune while inflicting serious pain on the UK economy. The argument is that this kind of high-level meddling in international affairs is driven by portfolio protection.
But importantly, the analysis doesn't just point fingers at the left. It frames this as an equal opportunity power grab.
That's really crucial for understanding the source's perspective. They are equally critical of similar long-term power plays on the right. They cite Rupert Murdoch's decades-long strategy of buying up AM radio stations, then Sinclair Broadcasting, creating this vast network to synchronize conservative messaging across hundreds of local markets.
So different methods, same goal.
Yeah.
Shaping public opinion and policy.
Exactly the same goal. Whether it's through NGOs and foundations on the left or through media ownership and think tanks on the right, the sources argue that massive capital is always seeking to structure the rules of the game markets, regulations, political discourse in its favor.
And the takeaway isn't about which side is better or worse.
No, the takeaway is that this is just what concentrated power does. It seeks to perpetuate and expand itself, often regardless of the collateral damage to the broader economy or the majority of citizens who don't have a seat at that table. Everyone with the means is grabbing for power using the tools available to them. Hashtag 1.3 government shutdown, gridlock, and affordability.
All right, let's pivot from the influence of private wealth to the dysfunction within government itself. Washington, D.C. The government shutdown discussed in our sources was a record breaker, wasn't it? 35 days.
Yeah, 35 days at the time the source material was compiled. And it wasn't just political posturing. The consequences were immediate and, frankly, terrifying.
What kind of consequence are we talking about?
We saw real human impact and serious infrastructure risk. TSA agents in Houston started walking off the job they weren't getting paid. Think about that security implication.
Wow.
Even more critically, air traffic controllers miss 2 full paychecks. These are the people guiding planes, responsible for thousands of lives every hour. The situation got so tense that the Secretary of Transportation at the time, Secretary Duffy, had to publicly address the possibility of actually closing down U.S. airspace because they might not have enough staff.
Closing airspace? That's almost unthinkable. Mass flight cancellations, economic chaos.
Total chaos. It shows how brittle things can get when the basic functions of government stop. And the core political dynamic highlighted is, well, it's pretty cynical.
How so?
The analysis suggests that while politicians talk about keeping promises, funding a wall, securing budget items, whatever the fight is about, the real driver in these negotiations isn't solving the problem or easing citizen suffering. It's about leverage. It's about maintaining power and positioning for the next election.
So allowing the suffering becomes a bargaining chip.
In effect, yes. The political cost of blinking first outweighs the immediate human cost for those caught in the middle. That's the grim calculation that leads to these prolonged standoffs.
And that same gridlock, ironically, might be the only thing slowing down potentially damaging policies elsewhere, like in NYC.
It's a paradox, isn't it? The sources suggest that the only real mitigation for the potentially catastrophic policies proposed by Mamdani in New York might just be the inherent gridlock built into the city and state government structure. His power is checked by other elected officials, budget constraints, legal challenges. That very inefficiency might be a temporary shield.
Interesting. Okay, looking beyond the immediate chaos, there was some analysis about lessons learned, particularly for the Republican Party after those blue wave elections. A commentator named Vake had a strong message.
Yeah, Vake's commentary was essentially a wake-up call. The message was blunt. Stop playing what they called the woke left's game of identity politics.
And focus on what instead?
Affordability, pure and simple. The argument was, if Republicans want to win and actually serve their base, they need to become the party laser-focused on the things that hit people's wallets every single day. Electric bills, the cost of groceries, healthcare premiums, housing costs.
Get back to kitchen table issues.
Exactly. Cut out the cultural war stuff that, according to this analysis, just distracts from the core economic pain that's really driving voter anxiety and instability. Make tangible improvements in people's daily cost of living.
Which brings us to the bigger question of how to actually fix the underlying gridlock that causes things like shutdowns. The sources talked about different types of politicians.
Right. This interesting distinction between the spreadsheet politician, the wonky, detail-oriented type who actually understands policy mechanics, and the vibes politician.
The vibes politician, like who?
Think Reagan, Obama, Trump, maybe AOC on the left, figures who connect emotionally, who have charisma, who offer a feeling and energy more than a detailed plan. They argue that, unfortunately, modern politics seems to require that charm, that entertainment value to get elected.
But the vibes politician might not be great at the boring work of governing or balancing budgets.
That's the tension. So, if you can't rely on politicians themselves to prioritize fiscal sanity over political expediency, how do you force it? The sources propose a pretty radical mechanistic fix.
Something called the dead hand switch. Sounds ominous.
It does, yeah. It borrows the concept from, like, Cold War fail-safes. A system that triggers automatically if human control fails or is indecisive for too long.
How would that work for a government shutdown?
The idea is if a shutdown lasts longer than a predetermined period, say 15 days, 20 days, whatever X is, the dead hand switch activates automatically.
It triggers what?
It triggers pre-agreed, across-the-board, significant budget cuts, like maybe a 5% or 10% cut to almost every single government department's discretionary spending, maybe with specific carve-outs for defense or essential entitlements, but the point is it's automatic and painful.
So the pain of automatic deep cuts forces politicians to compromise and reopen the government just to stop the bleeding.
Exactly. It forces solvency by automating a drastic reduction in the size and spending of betterment. The thinking is no politician, regardless of party, wants to preside over massive permanent cuts to their own power base and programs. Their self-interest would compel them to avoid triggering the switch at all costs.
It's essentially trying to achieve smaller government through a kind of automated threat.
That's the built-in bias, yes. Proponents see it as a way to force fiscal responsibility and shrink government over time. But, there are obvious counterarguments, too.
Like, wouldn't indiscriminate cuts harm necessary functions? Research, infrastructure, safety regulations. It seems like a blunt instrument.
That's the big criticism. Is it smart reduction or just damaging austerity? The sources pushing this idea argue the government is already so bloated and wasteful that almost any cut is good. But others would say it risks gutting essential services and investment.
It really highlights the lack of trust in politicians to manage things prudently.
Completely. The analysis concludes that politicians, left to their own devices, will almost always choose more spending, more debt kicking the can down the road, because a truly responsible, beautiful deleveraging, a planned reduction, is just too politically painful in the short term. So the dead hand switch is proposed as this sort of forced, unpleasant medicine because the patient refuses to take it willingly.
Okay, so we've seen how political dysfunction and economic issues are intertwined. But does that same pattern of maybe complacency and short-sightedness show up in our physical and digital security too? Let's talk about that Louvre heist.
Oh, absolutely. It's almost a perfect, seamless transition. The same kind of human error and systemic neglect we see in politics and economics plays out vividly in security failures. And the Louvre incident is just, well, it's a jaw-dropper.
So this wasn't some Ocean's 11 super sophisticated job. It was $100 million in jewels taken.
Not at all. Broad daylight, October 18th. But the investigation afterwards peeled back layers of shocking insecurity. The headline grabber, of course, was the password for the entire video surveillance system.
Okay, hit me with it.
Louvre, all caps.
Well, seriously, Louvre for the Louvre's security system.
Serious, it all sounds like a joke, right?
One of the world's most famous museums, priceless artifacts, and the password is the name of the building.
What does that even tell us about security culture at these major institutions? Are we just hoping for the best? It suggests that the kind of lazy security practices you see in movies, guessing the password is password or the dog's name, are depressingly plausible in real life, especially when, budgets get tight or management just isn't focused on rigor. But it gets worse.
There's more. How could it get worse than Louvre?
Because the password was just the symptom. The underlying disease was years of systemic neglect. Apparently, a major security audit back in 2014 had already flagged serious problems with their systems, both digital and physical.
And they didn't fix them.
It seems not effectively. Documents that surfaced later indicated that as of 2025, the museum was still running critical security software that they'd bought way back in 2003.
Wow. Okay. Old software is one thing, but was it at least updated?
That's the kicker. It was running on Windows Server 2003, an operating system that Microsoft stopped supporting, meaning no security patches, no updates, way back in 2015, 10 years prior.
So wait, the password was terrible, and the system it was protecting was running on software that hadn't been patched for known security holes for a decade?
Bingo. It's this perfect storm of human laziness, the password, technical debt, the ancient OS, and administrative negligence, ignoring audit warnings. Even if the password had been super complex, the system itself was likely wide open to attack.
That's just astounding negligence for such a high-value target. It's a lesson that applies way beyond museums, I imagine.
Absolutely. It's a universal lesson for any critical infrastructure, anywhere. Complacency kills. Hashtag 2.2, critical infrastructure at risk, Dutch in global context.
Okay, let's scale that up. If the Louvre can be that insecure, what about actual critical national infrastructure? Our sources suggest geopolitical rivals are actively probing weaknesses.
They are. And one of the highest risk areas globally is the physical infrastructure of the internet itself, the subsea communication cables.
The ones that carry almost all international data traffic.
Exactly. And there's documented evidence of active Russian interest in mapping and potentially exploiting vulnerabilities in these cables. The sources specifically mention the Russian ship Yantar.
What's special about the Yantar?
It's basically a spy ship disguised as a research vessel. It's equipped for deep-sea surveillance, it has submersibles, and it's designed for precision maneuvering near the seabed. It's been repeatedly sighted loitering near known cable routes.
What's the purpose of mapping them? Just knowing where they are.
It's more specific than that. They're likely mapping the precise points of vulnerability where cables cross difficult terrain, where there's less redundancy, the exact spots where a cut would cause maximum disruption.
So they map it with one ship.
And then potentially send another vessel later, maybe something less conspicuous like a fishing trawler or a commercial ship from their Black Fleet, to go directly to that mapped weak point and sever the cable. You don't need missiles. Sometimes all you need is a grappling hook or even just dragging an anchor accidentally in the right spot.
A single cut could take out communications for large regions. Triple financial markets.
Potentially, yes, especially if they target multiple key cables simultaneously. It's a surprisingly low-tech threat with potentially catastrophic high-tech consequences.
Alongside these physical threats, the sources mention this concept of a digital bomb, something called Phase Zero.
Right, Phase Zero. This is more in the realm of high-level cyber warfare. Think of it as a digital weapon of mass destruction.
Known by both sides.
Right.
Like nuclear weapons.
That's the analogy the sources draw. It's understood to be a highly sophisticated cyber weapon, likely held by both the West and Russia, capable of taking down vast swaths of enemies' critical infrastructure, power grids, water systems, communications, transportation.
The sources said it could cause medieval conditions.
That was the chilling phrase used, yeah. A successful, large-scale deployment could potentially cripple a modern society. But, like nuclear weapons, the main thing keeping it in check is deterrence. Mutually assured digital destruction.
So if Russia used it against NATO...
NATO would presumably retaliate instantly with its own equivalent against Moscow and its allies. That threat of immediate, devastating reprisal is what hopefully keeps Phase Zero purely theoretical. Its stability based on shared terror, essentially.
A fragile peace. Let's narrow the focus now to one country the sources analyzed in depth for its vulnerability. The Netherlands.
Yes. The Dutch situation is presented as particularly concerning, partly due to their unique geography and high level of digitization. The overall conclusion from the analysis is pretty stark. The Netherlands is not adequately prepared for a major shock.
What kind of shock are we talking about? Flooding.
Flooding is always a risk, obviously, but the number one vulnerability identified in this context is actually a sustained nationwide power blackout lasting more than, say, 3 days.
Why is that so critical for the Netherlands?
Because it's such a densely populated, highly interconnected, and technologically reliant country. A long blackout wouldn't just be inconvenient, it could paralyze everything. And a key reason for this vulnerability is a specific critical engineering choice they've made.
Which is?
It involves the Gebaseerd, the pumping stations that literally keep the low-lying parts of the country from flooding. These are absolutely essential.
Okay. What's the problem with them?
Historically, many of these crucial pumps ran on reliable, independent diesel generators, self-contained power separate from the main grid. But over time, driven by efficiency or environmental goals perhaps, many have been converted to run solely on electricity drawn directly from the national power grid.
Wait, so the system designed to prevent the existential threat of flooding is now dependent on the main electrical grid staying online?
That's the core criticism highlighted in the sources. These essential flood defenses are now vulnerable to anything that takes down the national grid, whether it's a Phase Zero cyber attack, a physical attack on power infrastructure, or even just severe network congestion or a technical failure. They've traded resilience for interconnectedness.
That seems incredibly risky, especially given the warnings they apparently had.
Exactly. The sources point out the irony that the pandemic, years earlier, had been identified in Dutch risk assessments as the #1 threat in terms of potential impact. After that crisis, there were calls for major investment in national resilience. A specific $300 million initiative was proposed by officials like Dick Scoof.
And it didn't happen. Or wasn't enough.
It seems it wasn't fully implemented or didn't achieve the necessary level of preparedness. Compounding that, the old structure for dealing with major crises, the Civilian Protection Organization, the BB, Bevolking, which was designed for large-scale, long-term emergencies, has been largely dismantled over the years.
So the infrastructure is more brittle, and the organization to manage a crisis is weaker.
That's a grim picture painted. Digitized systems create single points of failure, and the human organizational backup isn't there like it used to be. It's a worrying combination. Hashtag 2.3, corporate and regulatory accountability.
This theme of systemic failure, of perhaps unintended consequences from policy, seems to extend into the regulatory world too. Let's look at agriculture and this Bovar controversy in the EU.
Yes, the Bovar issue is a fascinating case study in what can happen when environmental goals, corporate interests, and agricultural realities collide. It revolves around a regulation mandating a 30% reduction in methane emissions from cattle.
Okay, methane from cows is a big climate issue. How are they trying to achieve the reduction?
Through a mandatory cattle feed additive. Farmers across the EU were being forced to use this specific product called DRIUP, which is patented and produced by the large chemical company DSM.
Sounds straightforward enough. Add this thing to the feed, methane goes down. Like a magic bullet.
That was the idea, a quick, scientific fix mandated by regulation. But the reality reported on the ground, particularly from farmers in Denmark cited in the sources, was very different.
What were the farmers reporting?
They were reporting sick cows, animals becoming lethargic, weak, having trouble standing. For cattle, if they stop eating because they're lethargic, their complex digestive system can shut down pretty quickly, often leading to death.
Wow, so the solution was harming the animals.
That's what the reports indicated. One farmer mentioned losing 3,000 liters of milk production per day because the cows were sick or less productive after being forced onto this additive. The mandated fix was actively damaging their herds and their livelihoods.
So, if the government mandates a product and that product causes harm, who's responsible? Is DSM liable?
This is where it gets really tricky. DSM, apparently, quite cleverly, included a liability disclaimer with their product. So they're shielded if it doesn't work or causes problems.
Okay, so the company's covered. What about the regulation itself? Can the government even check if farmers are complying?
And that's the other huge flaw identified. The chemical additive, DRIUP, cannot be detected in the milk or the meat from the cows that consume it.
Wait, so there's no way to actually test if a farmer is using it or not?
Exactly. The government is mandating this expensive, potentially harmful additive, but they have no scientific way to monitor compliance or verify if it's even being used. It creates this absurd situation where farmers bear the cost and the risk, the company is shielded from liability, and the environmental goal itself can't even be reliably measured or enforced. It's an accountability vacuum.
That's incredible. Shifting gears slightly, but staying with regulatory bodies, there was a similar fight described over transparency, this time in pharmaceuticals, involving the EMA, the European Medicines Agency.
Yes, and also the Dutch agency Louvre, which handles pharmacovigilance. This revolves around a major ongoing battle over access to data, specifically concerning reports of side effects from medicines and vaccines.
What triggered the specific controversy mentioned?
It became very public when the EMA apparently sent what was described as a coercive letter to some researchers. The letter effectively pressured them into retracting or removing a scientific article they had published that used EMA data related to side effect reports.
Why would a public health agency try to suppress research using its own data? That seems counterproductive.
The reasoning offered, according to the sources, is quite revealing about institutional mindset. Agencies like the EMA and Louvre in the Netherlands have increasingly started to view themselves as critical infrastructure for democracy.
What does that mean? They see themselves as pillars holding up the system.
Kind of, yeah. The logic seems to be, we are essential for public trust and health. Therefore, anything that could potentially undermine public trust in us, like publishing raw data that might be incomplete, confusing, or raise questions about our processes, is tantamount to undermining democracy itself.
So releasing potentially ambiguous side effect data is seen as an attack on democracy.
That appears to be the justification used for treating certain data sets, like raw reports from QR code systems tracking clusters, or weekly status updates, as if they were highly sensitive state secrets. They prioritize protecting the institution's image over maximum transparency.
But doesn't that lack of transparency inherently breed the distrust they claim they're trying to prevent? If people feel data is being hidden.
That's the fundamental paradox, isn't it? When public bodies are seen actively suppressing information, even if their motives are complex, it fuels conspiracy theories and makes genuine public health communication much, much harder in the long run. It creates the very suspicion they're trying to avoid.
Okay, we've navigated political gridlock, economic anxieties, security failures. Let's shift now to the tech landscape, where the pace of change feels almost dizzying. Perhaps the most profound area is the convergence of the human brain and machines.
This is where things get truly transformative, potentially species-altering. And the sources highlighted a really stunning new development in brain-computer interface, or BCI, technology.
What's the latest breakthrough?
Researchers unveiled a new type of brain implant described as sub-nano, nightlight trait, and wireless.
Okay, break that down. Sub-nano means?
Incredibly tiny, much smaller than previous generations of implants. The wireless part is also key. It's powered by light shown from outside, and it transmits its data back out using light signals.
So no wires, no batteries inside the brain. That seems like a big deal for safety and longevity.
Huge deal. It drastically reduces the invasiveness and complexity compared to older BCI tech. And the nightlight trait part refers to how it operates. Crucially, they managed to keep these implants recording data successfully in awake, freely moving mice for a full year.
A whole year of continuous recording from a wireless, light-powered nano implant. That's a massive milestone.
It really is. It demonstrates long-term viability and stability in a living organism. And this is building incredibly fast on the work we're already seeing from companies like Neuralink.
Right, Neuralink is already doing human trials, aren't they, for specific medical conditions?
Exactly. They're focusing initially on patients with severe paralysis, like quadriplegia or conditions like ALS. For someone in that situation, the potential benefit, being able to control a computer cursor, type messages, operate a robotic limb just by thinking, is absolutely life-changing. The risk-reward calculation is, as the source puts it, a no-brainer.
A small surgical risk for a potentially massive gain in quality of life and autonomy.
Precisely. But the really big question, the one that makes people uneasy, is about augmenting healthy humans. Putting these devices into brains that are functioning normally. How far off is that?
What do the sources project? Is this sci-fi, or is it closer than we think?
The timeline projected by the researchers cited is, frankly, startling. They estimate that augmentation for healthy humans could be viable and potentially available within 10 to 15 years.
10 to 15 years?
Yeah.
That's incredibly soon. You're saying a child starting kindergarten today might see this become a reality before they finish high school.
That's the time frame being discussed in the research community. Yes, it's genuinely transformative potential on a very near horizon. But there's still a major hurdle.
The surgery, right, the risk of actually opening up a healthy skull and brain.
That remains the primary barrier for widespread adoption in healthy people. Why take the significant risks associated with brain surgery infection, bleeding, unforeseen complications for what is essentially an elective upgrade?
Right, the benefit needs to massively outweigh that surgical risk for the average person.
Exactly. So while the tech itself is advancing at warp speed, that physical bottleneck of safe, reliable implantation is key. Someone cautious, like the speaker in our source, might say they'd personally wait 20 or 30 years, for the Neuralink 17 Pro model.
When maybe the insertion is minimally invasive or even non-invasive.
Perhaps. Waiting until the procedure is as routine and safe as, say, LASIK eye surgery. But given the pace of development, even that surgical barrier might fall faster than we currently imagine. Hashtag TagChat 3.2, the energy crisis meets AI expansion.
It's fascinating, this contrast. We're shrinking brain interfaces down to the nanoscale, yet the giant AI models driving this tech revolution are hitting very old-school physical limits here on Earth.
It's a massive paradox, isn't it? The digital world is soaring, but it's being tethered by basic physics and resource constraints. The CEO of Microsoft, Satya Nadella, put it very bluntly.
What did he say?
He stated that the single biggest bottleneck for the entire AI industry right now isn't algorithms, it isn't talent, it's power. Electrical power. He explicitly said Microsoft has warehouses full of advanced AI chips, the GPUs everyone wants, that they literally can't plug in.
They have the computing hardware, but not enough electricity to run it.
Or not enough sustainable, affordable electricity in the locations where they need it. The energy demands of training and running these massive AI models are just staggering. It takes huge amounts of power and also vast quantities of water for cooling the data centers.
Which immediately raises questions about the current AI investment boom. Is this sustainable? Is it a bubble if the basic infrastructure can't keep up?
It's definitely a critical question. It feels like a bit of both, maybe. The investment is fueled by the immense promise of AI, but these physical constraints are very real and could throttle growth or force a major correction. This resource crunch is why we're seeing these almost bizarrely extreme solutions being explored, like pushing the infrastructure literally off the planet into space.
I mean, data centers in orbit. That sounds like something out of Star Trek.
It's happening now. NVIDIA, the chip giant, has already flown one of their top-end H100 GPUs into orbit on a satellite called StarCloud-1. They're testing how well it performs, how stable it is up there.
Just testing it? Or is this a serious proposal?
Oh, it seems serious. Jeff Bezos, who obviously knows a thing or two about both spaceflight with Blue Origin and massive data infrastructure with Amazon Web Services, predicts we'll see gigawatt-scale data centers being built in space within the next 10 to 20 years.
Gigawatt scale. That's power plant level. Why build them in space? What's the advantage over Earth? Seems incredibly expensive.
Two huge advantages: cooling and power. First, space is a near-perfect vacuum, which makes cooling potentially much more efficient than on Earth, where data centers consume enormous amounts of water.
Okay, efficient cooling. What's the second advantage?
Consistent, unlimited solar power. If you put a data center in the right orbit, like geosynchronous orbit, it gets bathed in sunlight 24/7. No night cycle, no clouds, just continuous free energy once you've made the initial investment to get it up there.
So you bypass Earth's energy grid limitations and weather entirely. It's an incredibly complex and costly solution to a terrestrial problem.
It is. And it's not just data centers. We're even seeing attempts to manufacture the computer chips themselves in space.
Manufacturing chips in orbit. How does that even work?
There's a startup called Beckstar testing something they call FAB ships. These are basically miniature semiconductor fabrication labs attached to SpaceX rocket boosters. They run their manufacturing experiments during the brief 10-minute window of the launch and return flight.
Just 10 minutes? What can they learn?
They're evaluating if the sensitive semiconductor materials can even survive the intense vibrations and stresses of launch and re-entry. More importantly, they want to see if manufacturing in microgravity offers advantages.
Why would microgravity help make better chips?
The theory is that gravity subtly interferes with creating perfect crystal structures on Earth. In microgravity, you might be able to grow more flawless crystals, leading to better, faster chips. It also allows for creating things like perfect spheres, which is very difficult on Earth due to gravity, and has applications in drug research and novel material science.
So, the pull of Earth's gravity is literally becoming a constraint on technological advancement.
For certain very high-end processes, potentially yes. Companies are willing to contemplate the enormous expense and difficulty of space operations just to escape that fundamental physical limitation. It really shows the pressure these resource constraints are putting on the tech industry. Hashtag 3.3 consumer tech and policy fights.
Okay, let's bring it back down to earth for the last section. There are battles happening right now that affect consumers directly, touching on this theme of ownership versus access in the digital age. First up, the Stop Killing Games movement.
Right. This gained significant traction, starting as a large citizen petition in the UK and eventually being debated in their parliament. It's aimed squarely at video game publishers.
What's the specific complaint?
It's about the practice where publishers shut down the online servers required to play a game, sometimes just a few years after people bought it, effectively rendering a purchased product completely useless, killing the game.
Even single-player games sometimes require server access these days, right?
Often, yes. For authentication, updates, sometimes core functionality. So when the server goes dark, your game becomes a coaster. The argument being made, notably by a UK MP named Mark Seards, is that this might already be illegal under existing consumer protection laws.
How so? What's the legal angle?
His point was that when you buy a product, especially one that relies on external services to function, the seller should have an obligation to tell you upfront how long they intend to provide that service. If they sell you a game implying long-term playability and then arbitrarily pull the plug after a short time without warning, they've potentially breached the contract with the consumer.
That's a really important principle.
Hmm.
Because if it applies to games,
It could apply to all sorts of digital goods, software that requires online activation, streaming media you've purchased but can only access via their platform, even smart home devices that lose features when the company shuts down the back end.
it challenges that whole trend of you don't own what you bought.
Exactly. If this movement leads to legislation protecting game ownership or access longevity, it could set a huge precedent for digital consumer rights more broadly. The sources mentioned there's optimism this could inspire a similar push within the European Union, too.
Okay, one last consumer frustration point mentioned in the sources, this weird issue with battery banks in China, the triple C battery ban.
Ah, yes. This was a personal anecdote from one of the sources, but it highlights how arbitrary regulations can suddenly create headaches for ordinary people and generate e-waste.
What is this triple C regulation?
It stands for China Compulsory Certification. It's basically a Chinese domestic standard that's being required for a growing list of products, including portable battery banks or power banks.
But don't most good quality battery banks already have international safety certifications, like UL listed in North America or CE in Europe?
I absolutely do. That's the frustrating part. This new Triple C rule largely ignores those established international safety standards. It demands its own specific domestic certification process and stamp.
So your perfectly safe, internationally certified battery bank might be illegal in China now.
If it doesn't have that specific Triple C mark, yes. The traveler in the story had an expensive, airline-approved power bank confiscated at security simply because it lacked this new China-specific certification.
Just confiscated. Wow. And is the rule applied consistently?
Apparently not, which makes it even more maddening. The source indicated the ban was being strictly enforced on domestic flights within China, and maybe on trains too. But international flights into or out of China often seem to ignore it.
So it's this arbitrary barrier that mostly affects people traveling domestically within the country.
Seems like it. It effectively turns millions of perfectly good, safe, expensive battery banks made before 2024 into potential e-waste for anyone needing to travel within China. It feels less like a genuine safety upgrade and more like perhaps administrative friction or even a form of protectionism, demanding compliance with the domestic standard regardless of proven international safety.
Hashtag ouch. Wow. Okay, we have covered a huge amount of ground today. From Greek myths about knowing the future but being ignored, all the way to data centers literally orbiting the Earth. It's a lot to take in.
It really is.
For you listening, trying to make sense of this really intense period of, well, global instability, maybe we can try to boil it down to 3 key takeaways from everything we've discussed.
Okay, first, the political divisions we see are actively making economic pain worse, often by repeating historical mistakes. We talked about things like the rent control cycle, the focus on short-term political gain over long-term fiscal health. It fuels the affordability crisis and locks us into these damaging patterns.
Right. Second takeaway. Our critical infrastructure, both physical and digital, is alarmingly vulnerable. And it's vulnerable to both surprisingly low-tech failures, like the LUVRE password, and high-tech threats like cyber warfare or sabotage of things like subsea cables. Our interconnectedness has created fragility, and preparedness seems to be lagging way behind the risks.
Yeah, that Dutch example with the pumps was sobering. And third, technology is hitting an incredible acceleration phase, especially with AI and brain interfaces, but it's immediately slamming into fundamental physical limits. We have the potential for human augmentation, but the AI driving it is stalled by a lack of power. It's forcing these almost desperate solutions, like moving infrastructure into space. Solving that energy constraint is going to define the next decade.
So politics repeating bad history, infrastructure proving fragile, and tech hitting resource walls. That brings us back to something one of the sources mentioned right at the end, this idea about human predictability.
Yeah, the argument that history repeats or at least rhymes very closely because fundamentally humans react in very predictable, narrow-banded ways to the same old stimuli. Power, money, fear, self-interest.
We recognize the patterns, don't we? The economic cycles, the political maneuvering, the tendency to get complacent about security after a period of calm. We can almost see the train coming down the track.
We can. And that leads to the final, maybe most challenging question this deep dive leaves us with. If we know these patterns of failure, why is actually breaking them so incredibly rare? Why do we keep making the same mistakes?
And maybe more personally, what individual act of doing the difficult thing is required to change course? What short-term pain like maybe accepting economic adjustments for long-term stability or maintaining that boring, rigorous security protocol day after day are you, the listener, willing to endure to help avoid the predictable, often negative outcomes we've mapped out today across all these different domains?
That's definitely something to reflect on. How do we break the cycle when predictability feels so ingrained?
Food for thought. Thank you for going deep with us today.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
We'll see you next time for another deep dive.